So now we've arrived to the battle of the Hydaspes between Alexander the Great and King Porus. And yeah, this is a battle I'm fully aware of in that of how just hard fought it was. Like this is a battle Alexander, I believe, it's been said almost straight up lost. In that, it really pushed Alexander the Macedonian to the brink, which is why I have a lot of respect for King Porus, and I just can't wait for, kings and generals to fully break this down, because, like, this is one of the most renowned, hard-fought battles of Alexander's career, so I'm really looking forward to it. So without any further ado, let's see it, shall we?
With the Kothan Valley secured, Alexander left Taxiles and pressed deeper into the subcontinent, making for the Hyphasis River. To do so, however, Alexander would have to pass through the territories of numerous Indian kings, having to either defeat or subjugate them in order to protect his rear. This portion of Alexander's campaign, from Taxila to the Hyphasis, would prove to be one of the most difficult of Alexander's career. It brought his empire to its greatest extent, and was marked by one of his toughest yet most brilliant victories, but would also push his men to their most extreme breaking point. At the time, much of North India, where Alexander eventually planned to campaign, consisted of the powerful Nanda Empire, ruled by Dhanananda.
Yeah, I've heard about the Nanda Empire, and, Alexander wanted to go straight into it, but that, famously his soldiers were like, we're not doing that, we're not going in there, and then it forced Alexander to wheel back. There are sources that the great sheer size of the Nanda Empire army, I've heard rumors like over 200,000 men, yeah, so I had read that it had over 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, 2,000 war chariots, 3,000 war elephants. Oh wait, that was from the Quora here. In the Wikipedia, yeah, 200,000 infantry, 80,000 cavalry. Then again, it does say Plutarch might have inflated some numbers there. But point is, they had a really grand army, a very grand army. How accurate it is, I don't know, but point is, it was big enough, and I've heard that played a part in Alexander's army not wanting to fight that. And again, numbers, if true, and if that is the case, I don't blame them for not wanting to fight that. I know numbers aren't everything in war. Just having the bigger army doesn't guarantee success. Alexander has shown us that. But I feel like there does come a point where the numbers game can be too powerful. You know what I mean? And can dictate a battle. It isn't everything, but it is important. And I've always been of the opinion that if Alexander had marched into the Nanda Empire, into India, I personally think he might have lost. I mean, again, I know Alexander, as we've seen, is a tactical genius, and he's brilliant, and, I could be completely wrong. I just think that it would have not went that well for him. And I think it's a good thing his men made him pull back, because I think that saved his undefeated military career. I think he might have suffered a loss if he actually went in here. Again, that's just an opinion. Obviously some of you might be like, no, he would have been fine. And, valid. Alexander is one of the greatest geniuses of all time. It's just, I don't know why, I just get the feeling he would have lost. He would have suffered a defeat if he had gone in. And that it was probably a good thing for his soldiers to not want to. But, that's just an opinion again. So, yeah.
His empire stretched from Odisha in the east to the Hyphasis River in the west, and was said to be able to field hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Before confronting this empire, however, Alexander needed to subdue the numerous kingdoms that lay between the Taxila and Hyphasis in order to secure his rear. Emissaries had already been sent to the local kings, notably Abessares and Porus, requesting tribute and that they meet Alexander on the borders of their kingdoms. Abessares submitted to Alexander, but Porus, king of the Pauravas, was more stubborn. While little is known about Porus, it is clear from Greek sources that he was a formidable ruler. He was a renowned warrior, brave, strong, and standing an intimidating 7 feet tall.
Again, it's the, I think Porus was like a minor king, right? At least compared to the Nanda Empire, he was seen as, I think, a more minor power. And considering how much of a fight he gives Alexander, I could see the soldiers thinking like, yo, this is just one king. If we face the actual empire, imagine what would happen, right? When you're facing the actual monster. So yeah, I think that's also an indicator. Sure, Alexander adapts and learns. I don't doubt that he would have learned from Porus and adapted more accordingly when facing the larger Nanda Empire, but like I said, I don't know, that's just an opinion, you know?
And his physical attributes were matched by his intelligence, Porus being described as a wise, cunning, and respected leader. In response to Alexander's request, Porus replied that he would indeed meet him on his border, but that he would bring an army with him. Never one to refuse a challenge, Alexander, amid the monsoon season, marched to the Hydaspes with a force of approximately 30 to 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and 5,000 Taxilian allies. On the opposite bank, they saw the Pauravas' army, 35,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 chariots, and approximately 100 elephants. At their head, riding a large elephant, was Porus himself. Porus had chosen his battlefield well. The Hydaspes was wide and fast-flowing, meaning that any contested crossing, as Alexander had done at the Granicus, would be near impossible. He had further capitalized on his position by stationing his elephants in front of his battle line, knowing that their very presence would spook Alexander's horses and make any crossing even more difficult. Time was also on Porus's side. Abessares, though he had previously submitted to Alexander, had also promised to reinforce Porus. Alexander needed a quick victory, but with a frontal attack out of the question, a more cunning strategy would be needed. Alexander made his camp in clear view of Porus's men and sent out foraging parties. At the same time, he sent numerous scouting parties up and down the river, ensuring that they made plenty of noise while doing so. Porus in turn kept the majority of his force drawn up opposite Alexander's camp, but sent his own troops to mirror Alexander's scouts along the riverbank. The charade continued for days, Alexander's men bringing supplies into their camp and his scouting parties riding along the river with Porus's men mirroring their movements. Eventually Porus became convinced that Alexander would wait for the monsoon season to end and was only scouting for future landing spots, and stopped sending his men to parallel Alexander's movements. This was precisely what Alexander had been hoping for. Alexander had already identified his crossing point, approximately 18 miles upstream from his camp and densely wooded. The thick foliage had provided enough cover for Alexander's men to assemble rafts and boats in the area in preparation for his crossing, Alexander's feigned scouting missions hiding their movements. With these preparations made, and Porus lured into a false sense of security, Alexander made his move. He ordered the campfires to be kept burning, had his usual guard stationed outside his tent, had even dressed one of his companions as a double, and then, during the night, slipped away towards the crossing with 6,000 infantry, including Phalangites, Silver Shields, Hypaspists, Agrianians, archers, and 5,000 cavalry. Thanks to Alexander's numerous feints, any movement seen by Porus's army gave no concern. Craterus, meanwhile, was left in command of the majority of the army in camp, with Meleager and a force of mercenaries stationed between the camp and the crossing. The initial strategy was that Craterus's force would maintain the facade of the full army being encamped. Meleager's force would act as a further distraction by threatening a crossing, while Alexander would make the real crossing in secret and surprise Porus's force, hoping to lure the elephants towards him. Craterus would then also cross and catch Porus's army in a pincer, Meleager crossing where possible to join the fight.
Wow, I love this idea. Porus came up with a great idea, a great position to immediately, stomp Alexander. But Alexander, the genius that he is, found this other crossing and now has set up an ambush, a pincer threefold attack. Like, again, that's great. It's the execution that I'm worried about now. Like, with plans like these pincers, they seem so complicated and rely everyone to be, like, accomplish their goals. Like, but then again, I have faith in Alexander to execute a maneuver like this,
With his plans in place, Alexander's force prepared to cross. A thunderstorm swept through, threatening to derail the mission, but it soon died down, the heavy rain and cloud providing more cover for Alexander. His men crossed the Hydaspes to the assigned landing point. Upon completing the crossing, however, Alexander realized that he had made a mistake. What he had considered the opposite bank was in fact a large island, separated from Porus's bank by another channel of the river. As quickly as they could, Alexander's men brought the rafts and boats across the island to cross this channel, but by the time they made foot on the other bank, it was nearing dawn, and they were spotted by Porus's scouts before Alexander's force could properly assemble. Though Alexander's previous maneuvers had allowed him to cross unopposed, his plan had been based on him having the element of surprise, and that advantage was now lost. He would now have to face Porus's force head-on, with only a quarter of his army.
Dang.
Porus quickly sent 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots under the command of his son to engage Alexander's force while they completed the crossing. To buy time for his infantry, Alexander sent his horse archers to engage the chariots, splitting his own cavalry into numerous squadrons to surround the Pauravas, and charged. Fortunately for Alexander, the heavy rain had made much of the terrain almost impossible for Porus's chariots to maneuver in, and his men quickly gained the upper hand, killing 400, including Porus's son, before they retreated to the main force. They had, nonetheless, delayed Alexander enough for Porus to make his own preparations. Leaving a small force to contest any crossing from Craterus, Porus turned the majority of his army to Alexander, cavalry and chariots on the flanks, infantry in the center, and with his elephants in front, intending to use them to break Alexander's infantry formation. With Porus's army drawn up for battle and Alexander's initial plan of surprising Porus shattered, he recalled his cavalry, waited for his infantry to catch up, and formulated a new strategy. Alexander knew that the elephants would be the biggest threat to his army, and so, rather than attack Porus's center immediately, he planned to crush Porus's cavalry on the flanks first. In order to do so, Alexander split his more numerous cavalry into two parts. The majority, under his personal command, would attack Porus's left, aiming to lure all the enemy cavalry to that side of the battle, which would allow the second part, under Coenus, to flank around Porus's right and attack the Pauravas' cavalry from the rear. The infantry, meanwhile, would advance slowly, but with strict orders not to engage until they saw that Coenus's movement had been successful.
Yeah, I did not know about this whole, surprise pincer movement, going awry, and then Alexander having to face Porus with, not his full strength. Like, this is all new to me, which just makes it so much more interesting. And yeah, the elephants, man, like I said, elephants are great when you don't know how to fully deal with them, but once you get used to them, like the Romans did, just by throwing a crap load of stuff at them, yeah, they become a detriment. Though Alexander, I don't think is that used to completely fighting them yet, so obviously there's still a bit of an issue, at least at the moment. And yeah, it goes to show you, Alexander has to think on the spot. Like, his plan did not go. Now he needs to be flexible and adapt. So this idea, this flanking, taking out the cavalry first, probably the best move he can do. Though, as we know from this battle, it becomes quite the battle. So yeah, I guess we'll see.
After giving his men time enough to recover their breath from the river crossing, Alexander began his attack, launching 1,000 horse archers at Porus's left. While the Poravian cavalry was thrown into disarray by the storm of arrows, Alexander led his companions and the bulk of his cavalry around to hit their flank. Just as Alexander had planned, Porus diverted his cavalry from the right to reinforce his left. Coenus now made his move, flanking the Indian right and circling around to hit
the flank, the oldest trick in the book. Wow, it's actually going as planned, dang.
Porus's cavalry in the rear. The Poravian horse, attacked from two sides, soon broke under the pressure, retreating towards the safety of the elephants in the center. Porus began to move his elephants to attack Alexander's cavalry to try and save his left, but Alexander's horses were easily able to pull back before the slower elephants could engage them. Meanwhile, Alexander's phalanx had now closed in on the Indian center, attacking the mass of infantry, elephants, and scattered cavalry. The elephants charged the phalanx, but Alexander had already prepared his men for fighting the beasts. Where possible, the phalanx gave ground to absorb their charge, thrusting their long sarissas at the mahouts or aiming for the elephants' eyes. Agrianians and light infantry were also sent against them, some attacking with javelins, some chopping at the elephants' trunks and legs with axes and swords. Nevertheless, the elephants caused heavy casualties, trampling many, picking up and throwing men with their trunks, and impaling others on their tusks. It was a scene of utter carnage. The elephants, though, many of whom were wounded and terrified, soon began to desperately try and escape the chaos, rampaging back through Porus's infantry and causing still more casualties. Alexander and the cavalry, meanwhile, kept attacking the sides and rear of Porus's center, until Porus's army was completely surrounded, the phalanx pushing from the front, Alexander and the cavalry from the rear, and the panicking elephants running amok in the middle. Under such fierce pressure, Porus's men gradually started to break, fleeing through the gaps in Alexander's cavalry. By this point in the battle, Craterus and Meleager had crossed the river with their portions of the army, pursuing the routing forces. Though some of the Pauravas had broken, others still fought on, Porus among them. Surrounded by his personal guard, he fought bravely for as long as any of his men did, throwing javelins from atop his elephant. He was wounded numerous times in the fighting though, at one point almost losing consciousness due to blood loss, and was eventually compelled by his men to retreat, the battle now clearly being lost. Alexander, however, had been impressed by Porus's determination and bravery, and sent men after him, compelling him to surrender. Wounded as badly as he was, it is debatable how much say Porus truly had. Nevertheless, he gave himself up and was brought to Alexander. Upon being asked how he wished to be treated, Porus famously replied, "Treat me as a king." His request was granted. Porus was treated by Alexander's best physicians and was allowed to rule as a vassal king under Alexander. Alexander later even gave more land to Porus to rule.
Wow.
The battle had been one of Alexander's masterpieces, as it displayed his mastery of psychological warfare, as well as feints and logistical knowledge in effecting a crossing of more than 10,000.
I know, his original plan didn't work out, but he quickly maneuvered and on the spot created a new battle. And just it just goes to show you the impressiveness of Alexander, man. And I have a lot of respect for Porus, man. The dude really put up a great fight, I feel. And I have a lot of respect and admiration for Porus for his performance against Alexander, you know?
1,000 men in the night undetected. Once the initial plan had been foiled, Alexander also demonstrated his ability to devise a winning strategy under pressure and in moments. Arrian claims Alexander and Porus's losses as 310 and 23,000 respectively, while Diodorus suggests over 1,000 dead for Alexander, Porus suffering 12,000 dead and 9,000 captured. Given the chaotic nature described in all the sources, particularly the role of the elephants, most modern historians tend to agree that Diodorus's figures are more realistic. Among Alexander's casualties was his horse, Bucephalus, who was either killed during the battle or died soon after, possibly from wounds he sustained there. Bucephalus had carried Alexander since boyhood, through numerous campaigns and battles, and his death affected Alexander deeply, the king even founding a city, Bucephala, in his honor.
Yeah, I had heard him naming a city after his own horse, which is actually really sweet. Oh, that's so sad. I always hate watching animals get killed or, like, hurt. Which is why probably my favorite part of the military evolving is relying less on animals, at least in direct battle now. Because it's like, yeah, we've retired animals a lot, which I'm happy for, because I don't like watching them get killed or hurt, you know? It's always, like, not fun to see.
At this point, it is worth addressing the myth that Alexander in fact lost the Battle of Hydaspes to Porus. Proponents of this idea point to the fact that Bucephalus died, that Porus was kept as king, and that there are only Greek sources for the battle as evidence for this view. They also cite the account of Justin and the Alexander romance, both of which claim that Porus and Alexander duelled each other on the battlefield, Porus killing Bucephalus in this version. The arguments are weak. Justin's reliability leaves much to be desired, as his work is a summary of a previous more detailed account, and varies wildly in its accuracy. The Alexander romance is even more problematic. Though some parts of it are rooted in historical sources, it was adapted by many cultures over centuries, eventually becoming more like a myth or fairy tale of Alexander's life than true history. The Alexander romance, for instance, claims that Bucephalus was a man-eating horse, that Alexander used 24,000 metal elephants at the Battle of Hydaspes, and that Porus used magicians in the battle. To no surprise, the text is largely considered unreliable. It is worth noting, however, that even though both Justin and the Alexander romance mention Alexander dueling Porus, both sources record the battle as a victory for Alexander, and also add the incorrect but often overlooked detail that Alexander killed Porus during the battle. The other claims are equally easily disproved. While Greek and Roman sources are indeed the only extant sources for the battle, they are unanimous in recording that Alexander won. In comparison, we have no Persian sources for the Battle of Granicus, but such a lack of sources does not count as evidence that the battle was lost. Alexander keeping Porus as king aligns with Alexander's prior treatment of captured rulers and nobility. Mithranes, Mazaeus, Erasmes, Prataphernes, and Oxyates are all examples of men who directly fought against Alexander, but later surrendered and were either appointed to their previous positions or promoted. As for the death of Bucephalus, although it highlights how hard fought the battle was, the death of a steed says nothing about the fate of the rider, nor the conclusion of the battle. Alexander's Indian campaign did not stop after the Hydaspes, and he was able to push further into the country, further evidencing his victory. Porus was, by all accounts, a talented ruler and brave warrior, worthy of respect and admiration for the feats he really did perform, without needing exaggeration. Claims that Alexander lost the battle are not supported by any academic historian or classicist, and should be labelled what they are: poor history at best, rank propaganda at worst. Following the battle, Alexander advanced beyond the Hydaspes, accepting the surrender of numerous kings in the area, including Abyssares, giving much of their lands to Porus to govern as a vassal or satrap. The majority of the local peoples submitted to Alexander, but some, notably the Cathaeans, Oxydracians, and Malians, resisted. After resting his army in Porus's lands, Alexander marched on the Cathaean capital of Sangala, alongside Porus and 5,000 of his men. After 3 days' march, Alexander arrived near the city, finding their army, at least 20,000 strong, stationed outside the city on a hill, surrounded by 3 makeshift walls of wagons. Alexander led the first wave of the attack, dismounted, and fought alongside his companions. They were able to overcome the first line of defences relatively easily, but the second proved much more difficult. Eventually, though, Alexander's army was able to break through the defences, forcing the Cathaeans to retreat into their city. The city proved to be too large for Alexander to completely encircle, instead deciding to assault the walls with siege towers. The fighting proved to be particularly difficult, with Alexander losing as many as 1,200 men dead or wounded, but he was ultimately successful. Alexander reportedly took 70,000 Cathaeans as prisoners and razed Sangala to the ground, possibly as revenge for the comparatively heavy casualties he sustained. For weeks, Alexander's army continued their march inland, suffering from various tropical diseases, snake bites, and other dangers, heading for the Hydaspes River. Beyond this river, Alexander had heard reports of nations such as the Nanda Empire, which had fertile lands and large populations, and were to be the target of Alexander's next phase of his campaign. He had been warned that these nations had colossal armies, totaling in the hundreds of thousands, as well as thousands of elephants. But Alexander was nevertheless determined to press on, confident that he and his army would be able to overcome them. Alexander, however, had made a mistake. He had misjudged the attitude of his army. At the Hydaspes River, they mutinied, refusing to march any further. It was not the first time that his men had shown signs of fatigue. Similar concerns had been voiced following the death of Darius, but this was the first time they had point-blank refused to go on. Alexander appealed to them, assuring them that the rumors they had heard regarding the Nanda armies were surely exaggerations. He listed the nations that he and his army had conquered, imploring men to press on further to complete his grand strategy of conquering all of Asia, saying, "Glorious are the deeds of those who undergo labor and run the risk of danger, and it is delightful to live a life of valor and to die leaving behind immortal glory." The speech was met with silence. Alexander encouraged any man to speak their mind, saying that anyone who disagreed could feel free to say so. Still, there was silence. Alexander had always been loved by his army, but the fate of Cleitus and Callisthenes, who had both spoken out against Alexander, was perhaps still too close a memory. Alexander grew angry and annoyed, declaring, "Alone I shall persist in going on. Expose me to the rivers, the beasts, and those nations whose mere names you dread. I shall find men to follow me, deserted though I am by you. Go then back to your homes. Go in triumph after having abandoned your king. Here I shall find the victory of which you despair, or the opportunity for an honorable death." Some of his men began to break down in tears upon hearing this, but still no one said a word. Finally, Coenus, one of Alexander's finest generals, who had recently distinguished himself at the Hydaspes, spoke up for the men. He firstly assured Alexander that he and the men would, in his words, "go wherever you order, to fight, to incur danger, at the price of our blood, to hand your name to future generations. If you persist, we, even unarmed, naked and worn out, will follow wherever you desire." Coenus then pointed out, however, that after years of campaigning, their armor and weapons were broken and tattered, and that many were now past their fighting prime. They had lost thousands of comrades over the years, some to battles, some to disease, some to the weather or wild animals. Those that were left, Coenus argued, had earned the right to return home and enjoy the glory and riches that Alexander had brought them. Coenus continued, pointing out that Alexander had already won eternal glory, and that he risked losing it all if he pushed on with an army that was starting to weaken. It would be wiser, he reasoned, for Alexander to return to Macedonia, rest his men, and then begin a new campaign with a fresh army. Coenus' speech was greeted with applause and cheers from the men.
I mean, he's completely right. It's the war weariness. Sure, Alexander wants to go on forever, I'm sure, fighting. But it's like, yeah, it's like, you know, they've already been through so much, like, the Macedonians, you know, between the constant fighting, like, again, that war weariness and just constantly having to go, you know, Alexander's wearing out this great army, you know, the armor, the weapons are breaking and aging, the people are already, you know, like, what, over 10 years of fighting, many would already be past the point, you know. Yeah, Coenus is completely, I side with Coenus, like, yeah, dude, if you're gonna do this, at least, like, you know, consolidate your gains, and then, like, rebuild. Like, Coenus, I think, approached that appealing to reason and logic, and I feel like that's the best way he could have gone about it, in dealing with Alexander, you know?
Furious, Alexander dismissed them and stormed off to his tent.
But Alexander's still pissed. He's like, gosh darn it.
He remained there for 2 days, hoping that the men's attitude would change. On the third, when it became apparent that they would not relent, Alexander emerged from his tent to perform his regular sacrifices. He proclaimed them to be unfavorable, saying it was a clear message from the gods, and that as a result, he would lead the men home. It was clearly a face-saving act from Alexander, designed to give him an excuse to agree to the men's demands without admitting defeat. But none cared. His men were overjoyed, greeting Alexander with tears and praises, and the latter reconciled with the army. To mark the extent of his campaign, Alexander ordered the construction of 12 large altars, one for each of the Olympian gods. Alexander's campaign, originating in Greece 10 years earlier, finally reached its limit at the Hydaspes River in Punjab. Alexander had, in Arrian's opinion, finally allowed himself to be defeated, not by an enemy but by his own men. Alexander turned his army around and began the march back to the Hydaspes River. Shortly after this, Conquest died. Most sources say it was an illness that killed him, and no source makes any implication that Alexander was involved. Some
Why? I think it's funny that the first thought I had is Alexander murdered him. It's like deep down super resentful. It's like, send in an assassin, get rid of him, you know? I mean, I don't know, it seems a bit odd. The dude who spoke out against Alexander kind of got killed. There's been a trend, if you haven't noticed. Again, I don't want to accuse Alexander of murder.
Some modern historians, however, do consider it suspicious that Conquest died so soon after publicly disagreeing with Alexander, and suggest that Alexander may have had him killed as he had done with Callisthenes. Nevertheless, the army soon reached the Hydaspes, where a large fleet had been constructed to sail Alexander's army down the river in preparation for the journey home. However, although Alexander's campaign had reached its greatest extent, it was not yet over. The Malians and Oxydracians, who had previously resisted Alexander, inhabited land along the banks of the Hydaspes, and so long as Alexander had an army, there would always be more conquests. Thanks again to World of Warships for get the game for free via our...
So the next... Oh dang, we're already here. The next episode will be Alexander's last war, the Melanian campaign. So I guess I'll see you guys tomorrow when we wrap it up. Bye everyone.